In the 1920s, two men ran into each other on the streets of New York. One was dressed in some dirty old rags. The other wore a tailored suit and a hat. A few years earlier, they had faced each other in the boxing ring. In the lead up to the match, a newspaper had suggested that the man now dressed like a bum might become the next world heavyweight champion. That didn't happen, to say the least. The man in rags was now nothing but a heavy drinker. His name was Magnus Larsen. The man in the suit, however, was what people had predicted Magnus Larsen would become. He was a world champion. His name was Gene Tunney. "What happened to you, Magnus?" Tunney might have asked. And if he did, he wasn't the only one asking. This episode is about a man with enormous potential who didn't make it in the land of opportunity. So far in this podcast series, I've focused on well-known Norwegian-Americans. They came from different walks of life, but they all achieved something rather extraordinary. But America, and the idea of America, wasn't only shaped by the successful and those who were fortunate. It was also shaped by misfortune, by those who fell short, and by the stories we tell about them. The story I'm going to tell today is one such story. It is the story of Magnus Larsen, also known as Magnus Wolf Larsen, a once promising boxer. Magnus Larsen was born in Austre Moland in southern Norway in 1901. But he didn't grow up there. As a matter of fact, he didn't grow up in one place at all. His family lived on a boat and traveled along the Norwegian coast, picking up odd jobs along the way. They were so-called travelers, or tatere, a group of people who for centuries lived outside the mainstream Norwegian society. Here is Tor Gotaas, whom you might remember from the last episode. He has written a book on Magnus Larsen, as well as a book about tatere.
We think that the original Tatars in Norway came from India, that they are related to the gypsies. The gypsies are recorded in Crete in 1338 and in Norway, Denmark in the beginning of the 1500s. And when the laws in 1536 talk about tatere, they talk about gypsies. So tatere in Norway was the same as gypsies, and also some people that joined along the route. So he had blue eyes and red hair, so he probably had some ancestors that came from Norwegian families. And we know that in the 1800s, a lot of poor people joined the travelers. We also had something called vagabonds, loffere, same as tramps in USA. But he belonged to a group with a separate language, with a separate lifestyle, and they had this connection in between the families, and they would meet up several times a year. And he was in lifestyle a typical tater, and his family was known to be fighters.
It was also fighting that sealed Magnus Larsen's life prospects from the very beginning. In 1904, when Magnus was 3 years old, his family was living on a boat along the Loelva River in Christiania, in present-day Oslo. The area was rough, marked by frequent fighting and heavy drinking. One day, a woman named Amanda Lavik started shouting insults at the Larsen family. Amanda Lavik clearly liked to stir things up. Earlier, Lavik had challenged Magnus' mother to a fight, but Magnus' mother had ignored it. Magnus' father, however, Andreas, did not ignore it. He rowed across the river to confront Amanda and her husband, Oscar. That turned out to be a fatal decision. As soon as Andreas arrived, Amanda and Oscar attacked him with knives. He managed to avoid the first blows, but the attack did not stop there. Stones soon began flying through the air. Andreas slipped and fell into the river. That gave the Laviks a new chance to strike, while Magnus and his siblings watched it all from the shore.
And 6 children saw the father got killed with a knife, stabbed to death. So he had a traumatic experience seeing his father got killed, and the rules in Norway at that time was that if one of the parents were dead, a local board would send the kids to a farm or to a farmer so they could grow up there instead of traveling by, in this case, with the mother. She married someone else, and Magnus Larsen, he came to a farm in Gjerdrum with his sister, and there he spent his early years working on the farm. He worked on the farm when he was 5-6 years old, and he started school when he was 10, and he was famous for having thick arms and red hair and being a very wild boy.
Larsen started school at the age of 10. That was late for a Norwegian boy at the time, but not unusual for Tatar boys, who were often denied the same opportunities as others. According to Gotaas, he was no dummy. He showed particular talent in mathematics. Still, his label as a fatherless Tatar boy remained a constant obstacle.
So the problem was that these kids were often exploited because they were free, they worked for free. So I think he was a very good worker and a hard worker, but his temperament was very strong. And as the story goes, he beat up his father or stepfather in Brunales, I have heard, and he went to sea when he was around 15 years old, and he became a sailor, as many other Norwegians. Because in 1916, around that time he went to sea, Norway was the 4th biggest sea nation in the world after USA, England, and Italy. But if you compare to the population, Norway had the biggest amount of sailors. We were maybe 60,000 people working on the sea, and we were a sailing nation.
And this was during World War One, obviously.
Yeah.
So extra demand.
Yeah, and he was. Brunales is close to Larvik, and Larvik is along the coast, so it was natural for him to go on the boat. Yeah. After the confirmation in 1916.
So this was a way for young people to get a trade, let's say, earn a little bit of money, and also see the world.
Yeah,
pretty much.
He had an adventure. He wanted to have an adventure, and since his father was dead, his mother was not around, and his siblings were spread. So it was a way to get around, and he would also make pretty good money, or not pretty good, but good money. And since Norway had so many sailors, it was he was on a Norwegian boat. He would be with Norwegians. He could go to Rotterdam. He could go to San Francisco, go to ports and meet other Norwegians. So it was a pretty natural way to survive for a boy of his class.
There was a strict hierarchy on board the ship, and Wolf Larsen started at the bottom. He was not allowed to climb the ropes or go up the mast. He worked in the mess hall. He set the tables, served food, washed dishes, and cleaned. He worked 15 to 16 hours a day. But it didn't take long for Magnus Larsen to earn the crew's respect. At one point, their ship, Håpe, was in Amsterdam. One of the sailors got very drunk and was robbed of his watch and other valuables. Magnus heard about it and went to a bar called the Liberty Bell. What followed was a storm of fists and flying chairs. According to the stories, it became so violent that passing policemen did not dare to intervene. When they returned to the scene with more men, Larsen was already gone. A few years later, he sailed as a young man, one step higher in the ship's hierarchy. Now he worked on deck, under the sun, and in the freezing wind, constantly being shouted at and ordered around. There were also rituals. As Gothos describes in his book, one took place when the ship crossed the equator. Then the crew was said to be under the law of Neptune, god of the sea. New sailors had to run naked across the deck, while older men beat them with sticks. They were expected to accept it, but Larsen did not. A few days before they reached the equator, men in costumes came to his cabin and tried to drag him out. When they began to hit him, Larsen fought back and knocked them down. Another man who felt his power was a pro boxer in Rotterdam in 1919. The boxer stood in a ring on a public square, a kind of street attraction. He challenged anyone to fight him, and he always won. Then Magnus Larsen stepped up, and to everyone's surprise, Magnus Larsen knocked the boxer out in the second round. That must have been some kind of turning point. Perhaps the moment he realized that boxing could be a career path. He stayed in the Netherlands for a while and trained at the Amsterdam City Gymnasium. Then he went back to the sea, first to Australia and eventually to America.
He came to the US and he lived in the Norwegian sailor home, and the priest, Norwegian seaman's priest, took care of him, and he was known to be, as I said, he was bright, he was willing to learn, he was a pretty innocent guy, at least compared to the life he had lived. So, and Norway had many Norwegians in the 20s. Around 60,000 Norwegians lived in Brooklyn. It was called Lapskaus Boulevard. 8th Avenue was called Lapskaus Boulevard, and I think it was the fourth or fifth biggest town outside Norway. So a lot of people from the west and south in Norway moved to New York in the teens and 20s, and even before that. It was like a Norwegian colony with Norwegian churches, Norwegian shops, Norwegians, everything. You could live in New York at that time without speaking English, because in the Bay Area in New York, biggest sailing town in the world with boats, in the 20s it was still around 500 Norwegian ships every year. In 1880 it was 1,200 Norwegian ships each year. Then the boats would stay there much longer, but in the 20s still 500 ships. And the Norwegian Seamen's Church in Red Hook had 300,000 visits each year, so 800 people every day visited the Seamen's Church. So he came to the US, but he also came to the Norwegian colony, so he felt at home there, yeah.
And he also comes to a city where like boxing is super big, to a point that is almost hard to imagine how popular boxing was in the US in the 10s and the 20s. Isn't that correct? I mean, like it
was extremely popular, and Jack Dempsey, he would fight, and I think it was more than 100,000 people that watched it, but boxing was popular. Also in Norway, boxing was popular in Norway. It was popular in New York. It was popular in many countries. So he started a sport where it was also possible to make a lot of money. So it was of course a business. It was a sport, but as you said, I think it's impossible or hard to understand how big it was then, because the American sports were big, but boxing was a sport where a man was fighting against another man, and the mafia, of course, the mob was connected to it, and it had many dimensions. And I know that it was several other Norwegians that were good fighters. A guy called Pete Sandstøl, for instance. Otto von Porat, Norwegian guy, won the Olympics in, I think it was 28. So he belonged to a Norwegian tradition, and he came to an American tradition, and he tried to do as good as he could, yeah.
The Norwegian sailor's home helped him secure a place in school. There he studied basic subjects such as reading, writing, and arithmetic. It is unclear what his plan was at this point, but he probably did not intend to go back to sea. The age of sailing ships was over. Steamships now ruled the oceans, and they required far fewer men on deck. Larsen also began to focus on boxing. At the sailor's home, he met a man named Hjalmar Andersen, who became his first trainer. Andersen told Larsen to lose weight. Larsen was only 5'10", but close to 200 pounds. And although he was muscular, he had a few extra pounds for sure. Andersen told him to start running, and Larsen ran in Prospect Park and Carroll Park every day. He also trained at the Norwegian Gymnastic Association in Bay Ridge. There, he practiced shadow boxing under Andersen's supervision. By the fall of 1920, the inexperienced Norwegian was already taking paid fights in New York's Harbor District, and he lost. The reason was simple according to a Norwegian-American newspaper at the time. He lost from a lack of even the most basic understanding of technique, the newspaper wrote. Soon after, Larsen turned to amateur boxing. He fought at Madison Square Garden in the AAU Metropolitan Championship, the amateur title for New York City. There, he met a boxer named Charles Caro. He lost again, but New York Times noted that he looked strong at the start and took heavy punishment as the fight went on. That became his trademark. He hit hard, and he did not back down. And despite of, or perhaps because of, his lack of polish, he became a cult hero in the Norwegian community.
They said that he was a Norwegian word mascot. I'm not sure what the English word is.
Mascot.
Mascot, yeah. And everybody knew about him because he was the guy that never were afraid to meet the stronger opponent, and he would almost get killed in the ring, and he would still rise and fight. And as I said, I don't think he wasn't the smartest fighter, but he had charm, he had charisma, and he was very popular.
Larsen always aimed for the knockout, and he improved the more he fought. Soon, he began to win. One of the fighters that felt his striking power was William Connolly from Boston. Larsen drove him into a corner with a rain of heavy blows and knocked him out. The referee counted. It took 5 minutes before the man who had smirked at Larsen a few minutes before regained his consciousness. In 1921, Larsen faced a boxer from Chicago of Italian descent. Boxing at the time was strongly ethnically oriented, and the match became a battle between two nations, not only a battle between two fighters.
We have seen this in films later from the 50s and 60s where the ethnic groups go against each other, but they did so in boxing, yeah.
And Norwegians and Italians often clashed at the time, didn't they? Why was that?
I think it was because the Italians, they were Latinos. They talked loud, they talked probably faster than the Norwegians. The Norwegians were called squareheads because they often had square heads. They were farmers, they had drinking raw milk, and they had square heads. they were square in their head because a lot of the Norwegians there were very Christian. The hard workers and the Italians were Catholics, and so the Protestants and Catholics were also a thing. So I think that a lot of Norwegians and Italians, they mixed very well, but when it came to fighting, they were enemies.
Larsen fought for the pride of the nation, and he fought in his own unmistakable way. He went straight at his opponent, he jabbed, then he rushed in with a wild haymaker that left him open. The Italian slipped under the swing and hit back. Larsen went down, but he got up again and again, and when Larsen did land a punch, he landed it hard. so hard that the Italian could not rise when the next round began. Larsen won by technical knockout. After that fight, Hjalmar Andersen at the Sailors' Home devoted himself fully to Larsen's career. He told him to lose more weight and move down to light heavyweight. Larsen did, and later the same year he reached the final of the New York State Championship. At the weigh-in, he was a few pounds too heavy. He had to get rid of them, so he ran to Times Square and back to sweat it off. That almost worked, but not quite. It took 8 weigh-ins before he was finally cleared. All the running took a toll, for sure, but Larsen made no excuses. He won the final in his first round. It caused a sensation. In just a few months, he had gone from a nobody to one of the most promising fighters in the heavier divisions. And it didn't stop there. He was selected for the AAU Metropolitan team for the Nationals in Boston in April 1921. He boxed for the Norwegian Gymnastics Society. He knocked out his first opponent immediately. In the next fight, he needed only 30 seconds. In the final, he was scheduled to fight Regio Maine. Maine pulled out before the fight, apparently afraid of Larsen's punching power. Larsen was now a national champion, and he was only 20 years old. He does not yet possess any noteworthy technique, but he has a fist that makes even the strongest man tremble, a Norwegian newspaper wrote at the time. With or without technique, he was now ready for the next step, to turn pro, and to turn pro for real. In 1921, he signed a contract with the manager Tom O'Rourke. O'Rourke had a history of picking up unconventional fighters and molding them in his own image. He had previously managed 2 black boxers, one of whom became a world champion at welterweight. Larsen was now his next prospect. O'Rourke gave him the ring name Wolf Larsen, taken from Norwegian character in Jack London's novel, The Sea Wolf.
So they say because all boxers needed a name, like a nickname, and Wolf Larsen was named after that, and since he was a Norwegian, and Jack London, he actually died I think in 1916, born in 1876, so Jack London was a famous guy, and it was useful to connect the boxer to a character in a famous novel by a famous author.
In hindsight, it should be noted that Larsen's nickname wasn't very fitting. He wasn't strategic or enduring like a wolf, quite the opposite. If anything, both his looks and his fighting style were closer to a pit bull's. But he was a shooting star. Is there a world champion inside Wolf Larsen? A Norwegian newspaper asked at the time. But the transition to professional boxing was anything but gentle. Amateur fights typically only lasted for 3 rounds. Professional fights, on the other hand, went on for 12. Moving from amateur boxing to pro boxing was, in other words, like going from middle distance running to a marathon, as Gotos points out in his book. Larsen lost his first professional fight to Ted Jameson in April 1921, and then lost again to the same man 6 weeks later. But in his third fight, he defeated Tommy Thompson, and then, in the next match, he knocked out Walter Donovan, who suffered 4 broken ribs and was hospitalized afterwards. With these victories came fame and glory, and Larsen embraced both, probably more than he should have. Gotos suggests that Larsen's talent and his extraordinary physical gifts, in many ways, also became his greatest curse.
I would say that when a person has so much natural power as he had, he wasn't, they say, not too keen on training. He started to drink. He got access to women, and he wasn't an ideal sportsman, but he rose also to meet the better pros. Yeah.
Yeah. And among them was
Gene Tunney.
Gene Tunney.
He fought Gene Tunney in October of 1921. Tunney was an up-and-coming boxer who would later become both light heavyweight and heavyweight world champion. In many ways, he was Wolf Larsen's polar opposite. He was slim, highly technical, and professional to the core. No drinking, only healthy food. And to the extent that he had a life outside boxing, he read novels and philosophy. Tunney was the type of boxer that entered the ring with a plan. Against a far more muscular Wolf Larsen, that plan was simple: to tire him out. Rumors said that Larsen was hungover when he stepped into the ring. He moved slowly and without fire, while Tunney danced around his hard-hitting opponent who struck nothing but air. It wasn't much of a fight. Tunney won by technical knockout. Fights like these gave little hope to those who believed that Larsen could be polished into a complete, well-rounded fighter. Still, he got back on his feet after the fight, at least for a while. He cut down on drinking and was in decent shape when he later the same year faced the Swedish champion Ragnar Holmberg. The match was billed as Norway versus Sweden, a neighborly rivalry, and Larsen won. That victory made him even more popular in the Norwegian-American community. But success was not easy for Wolf Larsen to handle. In a cruel twist, the triumph marked the beginning of his decline. More men were eager to buy him drinks, and more women wanted to get to know him. Over time, it became an expensive lifestyle, especially for Larsen, who wasted money left and right, and also was rather naive in his business dealings. In October 1922 and January 1923, he was persuaded by those around him to accept money to lose 2 matches against the famous boxers Billy Shade and Gypsy Daniels. When an investigation was opened, Larsen admitted everything. After that, he was banned from boxing in New York. In many ways, it was the final nail in the coffin of what could have become a great boxing career. New York was, after all, the boxing capital of the world, and Larsen was now banned for boxing there. He moved to Boston and continued to box, eventually becoming a nomadic fighter of sorts.
He boxed up in Canada, he boxed in Mexico, he was around in the US.
He never stopped boxing, huh?
He boxed all the time, and he ended up boxing for a few dollars just to get beaten up so he could have money for a drink. So he was the classical boxer with big power, not so much talent in tactique, and he ended up broke, drunk, homeless, but people would buy drinks, they would cheer when he walked in Brooklyn, and he looked very much older than his age was. He had his nose was flat, his face was marked over years of fighting, so he was a classical boxing type. And
during his steady decline, he did, however, get one last chance. The Swede, Martin Eriksson, was one of the best amateur boxers in the country, and he strongly believed in Magnus Wolf Larsen and offered him to spar with him on a regular basis. But once again, Larsen began to drink too much. He ended up fighting no match at all in 1926, the year Eriksson took him under his wings. And when Larsen finally returned to the ring in January of 1927, he lost. After that, Eriksson gave up on him. Once again, Larsen was back on the streets, shabbier with every passing day. On one of his walks through Brooklyn, Wolf Larsen ran into Gene Tunney. Their lives had taken very different paths after their fight some years earlier, and the sight of his former opponent, now a washed-up homeless man, must have made an impression on Tunney. Tunney bought Larsen a new suit, gave him food, and even helped him find a place to live. But Larsen sold the suit and spent the money on alcohol, and his life continued its downward spiral. In the end, he found himself in the Norwegian homeless encampment known as Ørken Sur.
Ørken Sur was a Norwegian Hooverville. Herbert Hoover was the president in the 20s. He was a Republican. A lot of people became homeless, and in New York alone it was 20 Hoovervilles. Ørken Sur was a Norwegian Hooverville. Up to 600-700 Norwegians lived in a Hooverville in Red Hook. It was an area with industrial garbage, and they moved there because they didn't have jobs, they didn't have a place to stay, they were not allowed to be in the US. It was 60 or 90 days. When you were a sailor and came to the US, you had to leave in 60 or 90 days. So they would hide from the government, or they would just hide and drink alcohol, because this was during Prohibition time. And Prohibition time, they say that people drank more than ever. Speakeasies was a forbidden bar, and they said it was 32,000 speakeasies in New York alone. And he was a drinker. I think he drank in periods. He didn't drink all the time. He would drink for a week or for weeks, and then stay sober, and then start training again. But he ended up in Ørken Sur with other Norwegians, other sailors from the south, and especially from the south and west of Norway.
During the homeless years, Larsen ended up in many street fights. Some of them were self-inflicted, but the main reason was that many wanted to fight him. Beating a famous boxer was, after all, the ultimate bragging right. And the drunker Larsen got, the more willing people were to take a swing on him. He was arrested more than once, and on one occasion, in Red Hook, he tried to break up a street argument. The woman involved misunderstood him and attacked him with a razor, slashing him badly. Larsen was hospitalized. Later on, a relative of this woman was killed, and Larsen was arrested, but the charges were later dropped. According to Gotos, Larsen was often chased by street gangs as well, especially Italian street gangs. He could usually handle a few men, but not always. One night in January 1929, he was stabbed on Hamilton Avenue, and he collapsed from blood loss. He reported his attacker to the police, but the man was protected by the mafia, and the corrupt police force did nothing. Later that year, the knife man did, however, turn up dead. Larsen was called in for questioning, but again, the case was dropped. Larsen kept company with criminals, and the situation grew more dangerous. In 1931, he brutally beat a gangster who was harassing a crippled man on the street. By then, the list of enemies was long. It couldn't end well, and it didn't.
This guy on the bar, Italian guy, he beat him up, and then the mafia wanted revenge. And in 1931, in June, he was in the graveyard to look after a grave to one of his friends. And the story goes, he got beaten up by one of the guys, and he passed away in 1931 at the age of 30. It was a Norwegian boxing tournament that in July 31, and he was supposed to be in the ring and be like a mascot. But he died in Norwegian hospital, I think, at the age of 30, and he had a short life, dramatic and short life.
In this short life, he became a national amateur champion and faced one of the greatest boxers of all time. But more than anything, his story is a story of wasted talent, of what might have been had things gone even slightly differently.
I was in New York and into a boxing historian in 2008. He thought he was also very good, or that had much more potential than he managed to get out of himself. So he knew a lot about Larsen, and when he passed away, the boxing community, they paid for his funeral. So he was a legend when he was alive and became a legend after he died. And I'm very glad that I wrote the book, because I like to write books about those kind of people, and he would have been forgotten if it wasn't for my book.
My name is Frederick Kalstveit, and this podcast was made in conjunction with Vestrand Museum and with the support of Norway House Foundation in San Francisco. The music you hear in the background was made by Jan Skoglund.